of 1948, this growing rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union came to a head in Berlin, where the Soviets decided to get rid of that annoying pocket of influence from the United States and Britain and France in Berlin. And they demanded that the United States and those allies remove themselves from Berlin, or else they would blockade the city and force the Americans to leave. And they did just that. Starting in June of 1948, they installed a blockade so that all the roads in and out of Berlin were blocked. Well, the United States' response to this was to launch a military operation known as the Berlin Airlift, and they began to airlift in using World War II B-29 bombers loaded up with goods and supplies, airlift in everything that the citizens of West Berlin needed to survive. One of the major items brought in was coal, but they also brought in food, bread, produce, vaccinations and medical supplies, fresh water, and all kinds of things, even including chocolate and candy, which became a very popular item with the children of Berlin. The airlift went on for almost a year, until May of 1949, when the Soviets finally realized that the United States could keep this up literally forever, if need be. And the Soviets decided to take down the blockades and reopen the city. This is in some ways the first significant clash of the Cold War, and it is seen as a victory for the United States. And on the whole, this is a good thing. The thought is the United States kind of stared down the Russians, and the Russians backed down first. On the other hand, it does also reinforce the thought that all of America's policies are working, and that in fact this is the best and proper way to go about things. And so the United States over the following 3 or 4 years is going to make similar kinds of decisions in the direction of confrontation, in the direction of let's stare down the enemy, rather than negotiation or trying to open things up a little bit. And so it's effective in this case, but what we will see is that it does perhaps lead us in dangerous directions down the road. It is also during this period that the Cold War is becoming more militarized. And as we know, it never does break out into World War III itself. But that doesn't mean that both sides are not preparing for World War III. And we certainly see that in the late 1940s and early 1950s, both sides preparing for what they thought would be the inevitable outbreak of war. On the American side, in 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act, which kind of reorganized and ramped up American military preparedness in a number of different ways. It created the Department of Defense out of the old War Department. And while this might be a semantic difference, there is a difference between defense and war. Defense is perpetual. You must always be at the ready, whereas war is a temporary thing. It shuts down when the war comes to an end. And so now with the Department of Defense, we are saying we're always going to be prepared and ready. It also created the National Security Council, which was a very important advisory agency to the President, and we will see the NSC playing a role very shortly. And it also created the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, as we will discuss with the Eisenhower presidency shortly. We are becoming much more interested and reliant upon spies and intelligence during this era. And the CIA, of course, plays a major role in that development. At the same time, both sides are engaged in the process of developing new and better and more powerful weapons. The United States, for a while, had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. That made the United States de facto the most powerful nation in the world. And then the Soviets tested their atomic bomb in 1949. And so both sides then begin working on the next great and powerful weapon. And the United States tested the hydrogen bomb in 1954. You see the awesome explosion from one of the tests of the hydrogen bomb there in the picture on the right. And so once again, the United States is the most powerful nation on its own until a year later when the Soviets tested their hydrogen bomb. And we could look at other developments in a similar vein, the development of nuclear submarines, the development of ballistic missiles, and things of that nature. But across the board, the two sides are preparing for the possibility of World War III. In April of 1950, the National Security Council responded to a request from Harry Truman with a document known as NSC 68, National Security Council, document number 68. Truman had requested from the NSC a sort of update as far as where are we, what is the state of things 5 years into the Cold War. So here we are in 1950. And the response was a document that was tremendously important at that time. NSC 68, it might not be a household word or something that you've heard of, but it was hugely important in shaping American policy over the next several years after its publication. NSC 68 did a number of different things. It's quite a lengthy document, and it's divided more or less into two parts. The first of which gives Truman his update as far as what is the state of things. So it's kind of listing where things stand across a number of different categories. And then the second part is more a series of recommendations as far as what should we do about this? What should our policy be? So let me just mention a few of these things. And again, the document itself is much longer than this. There are many, many things involved. But first of all, as far as the state of things in 1950, NSC 68 recommended that we maintain a hard line on communism. That, things like the Berlin airlift had worked, and so no compromise, no backing down, no negotiating, just maintain a hard line on communism. It also continued to restate George Kennan's idea that the Soviet Union was bent on world domination. That is, they're determined to conquer the world. In terms of technology, NSC 68 tells us that the United States was ahead in many important ways in terms of technology. Our missiles, in fact, were better, and other things at that time were more powerful than what the Soviets had. But does that mean that we should rest and not continue improving? No, quite the opposite. We needed to continue improving and making more weapons and better weapons. So it begins to encourage this, the idea of the arms race. In terms of policy, some of the things that NSC 68 advocated were a more aggressive stance than simply containment. While containment had worked up to this point, it was a very reactive policy, in some ways a defensive policy. You're always kind of looking for where the other side might expand. And so NSC 68 says that the United States should begin probing for weaknesses on the other side and looking for opportunities to expand. As I've just mentioned, it also advocated that we needed to continue growing our strength. Even though we were ahead at that point of the Soviets, we needed to build more weapons, better weapons. It also talked about strength in terms of political strength, cultural strength, just across the board. And finally, it argued that global politics was a zero-sum game. Essentially, there is a finite amount of territory on the Earth, and every inch of it mattered. And so if the Soviets expanded 1 inch of territory, then that was an inch that the United States lost. What we take away from an argument like that is that there was no place on Earth that was unimportant, according to NSC 68. And so in the very near future after this, we're going to be looking at places like Korea. We'll be looking at Vietnam. We'll be talking about Cuba. And there are many, many examples of this where we might ask, well, if communism were to take over in Korea, does that hurt us? Does it really matter to us? NSC 68 says, of course it does. Yes, every place on the globe is important. So if South Vietnam were to fall to communism, does that matter to us? Very much so, says NSC 68. And so it is in part based on the ideas of this document that the United States is going to pursue policies of intervening in places like Korea and Vietnam and Cuba and other places around the world. So NSC 68 was a very important document. Its thinking was flawed in a number of different ways, but this idea of the zero-sum game may be the most important one. And so presidents from Truman through Eisenhower and in some ways even beyond are going to base their thinking on this document that, while it is very important, was also misguided in a number of important ways.